The blood oath was broken the moment Adelrich of House Waldhart placed his newborn son into the arms of a banished slave woman rather than his own mother, the Luna Queen. Pack law demanded the heir be blessed by his mother's touch within the first moonrise, but the child, born deaf to the ancient wolf songs that called through every royal bloodline, turned his face away from Queen Marin's reaching hands and screamed until his throat was raw. Only when Lisbeth, the disgraced kitchen slave with the forbidden bloodline of the Eastern Ridge clan, lifted him against her chest did the future alpha fall silent, his tiny fingers curling into the rough fabric of her servant's dress as though she were the only anchor in a violent storm. The palace erupted into chaos. Council members shouted accusations across the throne room. The royal decree that should have celebrated the heir's arrival instead became a battlefield of ancient laws and modern betrayal. And in the center of it all, a deaf baby boy who had unknowingly chosen his own fate, and a woman who was never supposed to touch him at all. Before we go further into this story that will shatter kingdoms and rewrite destiny, I need to know something from you. Tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. Because what happens next will break your heart before it even thinks about healing it. Alpha King Adelrich stood frozen at the base of his throne, his silver eyes wide with a horror that transcended political disaster. His son, Theodoric, named for the ancient warrior king who had united the wolf clans 3 centuries ago, continued to wail in his mother's arms, his small body rigid with an infant's pure distress. Queen Marin, resplendent in her ceremonial lunar robes embroidered with moon phases in silver thread, looked down at the child she had carried for 9 months with an expression that shifted between wounded love and growing fury. "He rejects me," she whispered, and the throne room, vast enough to hold 300 witnesses to this disaster, fell into a silence so complete that even the torch flames seemed to stop crackling. "My own son rejects his mother's touch." The head oracle, an ancient woman named Ursula whose blind eyes saw more than any sighted wolf in the kingdom, stepped forward from her position beside the eastern pillar. Her staff struck the marble floor 3 times, the sound echoing like a judgment from the old gods themselves. "The child does not hear the pack's song," Ursula announced, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy and doom. "He was born outside the sacred bond that connects all wolves of royal blood. This is an omen." "An omen of what?" Adelrich demanded, his alpha command rolling through the throne room like thunder, but even his power couldn't mask the tremor of fear underneath. "Speak plainly, oracle." "My son is heir to the throne of Waldhart, firstborn of the royal bloodline, blessed by—" "He is blessed by nothing," Ursula interrupted, and the audacity of cutting off an alpha king made several council members gasp. "He cannot hear the wolf song that runs through our blood like ancient rivers. He cannot hear his mother's voice. He cannot hear the pack bonds that should connect him to every wolf in this kingdom. And without those bonds, he is vulnerable to influence from outside our sacred pack laws." That was when Lisbeth made her fatal mistake. She had been standing in the shadows near the servants' entrance, summoned to the throne room only because she had been warming milk in the kitchens when the royal birth began and had been ordered to bring emergency supplies. She was meant to be invisible, a 23-year-old woman with the cursed bloodline of the Eastern Ridge clan, the pack that had tried to overthrow the Waldhart dynasty 60 years ago during the Blood Moon Rebellion. Her great-grandmother had been executed for treason. Her family name had been struck from all official records. She existed in the palace only because someone needed to scrub the stones in the lowest chambers where even other servants refused to go. But when she heard the oracle's words, vulnerability, outside influence, unblessed, something ancient and fierce rose up inside her chest. Before she could stop herself, before centuries of ingrained submission could chain her tongue, she spoke. "He's not vulnerable," Lisbeth said, her voice rough from years of speaking only when absolutely necessary. "He's just different." Every head in the throne room turned toward her. Temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Queen Marin's eyes, the pale blue of winter ice, fixed on Lisbeth with the focus of a predator identifying prey. "A slave speaks unbidden in the presence of the Alpha King," High Counselor Walther said, his hand moving to the ceremonial blade at his hip. This is a violation of pack law punishable by immediate execution. Guards. Wait. It was Adelrich who spoke, and his single word carried enough power to freeze every wolf in the room. He descended the 7 steps from his throne, his movements carrying the fluid grace of a predator, and crossed the distance to where Lisbeth stood trembling in the shadows. What did you say? Lisbeth's heart hammered against her ribs. She had never been this close to the Alpha King. He towered over her by nearly a foot, his presence so overwhelming that her wolf, small and suppressed and half forgotten after years of forced submission, wanted to bare her throat in instinctive surrender. But she forced herself to meet his eyes, just for a moment, just long enough to let him see that she meant her words. I said he's not vulnerable, Your Majesty. He's just different. Being deaf doesn't make him weak. It makes him uniquely positioned to lead without the traditional bonds that can be manipulated or broken by enemy packs. He'll forge his own connections, his own way of understanding loyalty and pack structure. He'll be stronger for it, not weaker, if anyone gives him the chance to be. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Queen Maren laughed, and it was the coldest sound Lisbeth had ever heard. The slave with forbidden blood presumes to lecture us on raising the heir to the Waldhart throne, Maren said, her voice dripping with venom even as baby Theodoric continued to scream in her arms. The same bloodline that tried to destroy this kingdom now claims to know how to protect it. Guards, remove this woman from the throne room and prepare her for banishment. Clearly the mercy of allowing her to live as a servant was misplaced. No. The word came from the most unexpected source. Princess Sigrid, Adelrich's younger sister and third in line to the throne, stepped forward from where she'd been standing with the other royal family members. At 19, she was known for her fierce intelligence and complete disregard for political maneuvering. She looked at Lisbeth with curious golden eyes. I want to hear what she means, Sigrid said. We have no precedent for a deaf heir. We have no ancient texts that tell us how to proceed. The oracle says he's vulnerable, but this woman, who has no political reason to defend him, who gains nothing from speaking, says he's uniquely positioned for strength. I want to understand her reasoning before we throw away potentially valuable insight out of wounded pride. Wounded pride. Maren's voice rose to a near shriek, making the baby in her arms scream even louder. My son rejects me, and you speak of wounded pride? Your son is deaf, Sigrid said, her voice gentle but firm. He's not rejecting you. He simply cannot hear your voice the way other wolf pups hear their mother's call. It's not personal, Maren. It's biological. Then why, Maren said, her voice breaking, does he quiet when this slave holds him? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Everyone in the throne room had seen it happen 10 minutes ago. The moment Lisbeth had stepped forward to collect the soiled linens during the birth ceremony, Theodoric had been screaming in his mother's arms. Lisbeth had moved closer, intending only to gather the fabric and disappear back to the kitchens, but the baby's crying had suddenly stopped. His small face had turned toward her with eerie precision for an infant only hours old. And when Maren, startled by the sudden silence, had loosened her grip slightly, Theodoric had actually reached toward Lisbeth with his tiny, perfect hands. Without thinking, operating only on instinct, Lisbeth had put down her basket and reached back. The moment her fingers touched his, Theodoric had grabbed on with surprising strength and pulled, and Maren, shocked and exhausted from the difficult birth, had let the baby slide into Lisbeth's arms. The silence that had followed was more shocking than any scream. I don't know, Lisbeth admitted now, her voice barely above a whisper. But I felt something. When I held him. A connection that didn't require sound or pack bonds or ancient magic. Just recognition. Like he knew I wouldn't hurt him. Like he knew I understood what it meant to be different, to exist outside the normal bonds that everyone else takes for granted. Eastern Ridge wolves have an affinity for broken bonds, High Counselor Walther said, his tone making it clear this was an accusation. Your bloodline has always been able to sense weakness in pack structure, to exploit gaps in loyalty and connection. That's how your ancestors nearly destroyed the kingdom 60 years ago during the Blood Moon Rebellion. You're sensing this child's vulnerability and claiming to protect him when you're really identifying him as a potential tool for undermining the Waldheart dynasty from within. This is exactly the kind of manipulation we've feared from your bloodline for 3 generations. Enough, Adelrich said, and his alpha command hit the room like a physical force. Several lesser wolves actually stumbled backward. Lisbeth of the Eastern Ridge bloodline approached the throne. It wasn't a request. It was a compulsion written into her very bones by the authority of an alpha king, whose power could reshape reality with a single word. Lisbeth's feet moved before her mind fully processed the order, carrying her across the throne room under the hostile glares of nobles and council members, who saw her as nothing more than the living embodiment of treachery and shame. She stopped 3 paces from Adelrich and dropped to her knees, baring her throat in the ancient gesture of submission. "Your Majesty," she breathed. "Look at me," he commanded. She raised her eyes. This close, she could see that his silver eyes held flecks of gold, like starlight breaking through storm clouds. His face was hard with the weight of impossible decisions, but underneath she sensed something unexpected: desperation. The mighty Alpha King was desperate to understand why his son rejected his mother's touch but calmed in the arms of a cursed slave. "Oracle Ursula," Adelrich said, never breaking eye contact with Lisbeth. "Is there any precedent in the ancient texts for a deaf heir? Any prophecy or wisdom that might guide us through this disaster?" "There is one," Ursula said, and her ancient voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "The prophecy of the Silent Alpha, written during the First Age when the wolf clans were still forming bonds with the old magic. It speaks of a king who cannot hear the pack song, who will either unite all wolf clans under a new kind of bond or shatter the very foundations of pack law forever. The prophecy says this king will be marked by 3 signs. He will reject the traditional mother's blessing, he will bond with someone of forbidden blood, and he will face a choice at the palace gate that determines the fate of kingdoms." The throne room erupted into chaos again. Voices shouted over each other, arguing about prophecy interpretation, ancient texts, the reliability of First Age writings. But Lisbeth heard none of it. She was staring at Adelrich, watching his face as understanding and horror warred across his features. "He bonded with you," Adelrich said quietly. His words for her alone beneath the surrounding noise. "A woman of forbidden blood. That's 2 signs already, and he's only hours old. What's the 3rd sign?" Lisbeth asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "The choice at the palace gate," Adelrich said. "The prophecy says the Silent Alpha will face a choice when someone he's bonded with leaves the palace gate. The choice will be between tradition and transformation, between old laws and new loyalty, between the pack that raised him and the bond that called him. And whatever he chooses in that moment will determine whether the wolf kingdoms rise or fall." Lisbeth's blood ran cold. "Your Majesty, I'm being banished. I'll be forced to leave through the palace gate at dawn." "I know," Adelrich said, and the grief in his voice was profound. "That's why we have approximately 8 hours to decide whether to prevent the 3rd sign from occurring or to face it with preparation and purpose. Keeping you here means defying the Queen's direct order, violating pack law regarding forbidden bloodlines in proximity to the royal family, and risking the political stability of the entire kingdom because my hours-old son happens to feel comfortable in your arms." "Then banish me," Lisbeth said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "Send me away before the bond grows stronger. He's an infant. He'll forget me in days. Find another way to help him, another way to interpret the prophecy. Don't risk everything for a connection that shouldn't exist in the first place." But even as she said the words, Theodoric, still screaming in his mother's arms across the throne room, let out a wail so piercing that several wolves covered their ears. And Lisbeth felt something twist in her chest, a connection she couldn't name forming between her heart and the tiny life that needed her in ways she couldn't begin to understand. "No." The word came from Queen Marin, who had finally reached her breaking point. She stood at the base of the throne, her ceremonial robe stained with blood and birth fluids, her face pale with exhaustion and something darker. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at the screaming infant in her arms. Her son, her heir, her child who wanted nothing to do with her. "No, the slave is right," Marin said, her voice thick with grief. "Send her away. If my son has bonded with someone of forbidden blood, then we break that bond now, while he's too young to remember or mourn. We find other caregivers, other ways to soothe him. We do not allow a prophecy that speaks of kingdoms falling to fulfill itself simply because an infant showed preference for the wrong person. I am his mother. I will learn to reach him. I will find a way." But Theodoric continued to scream, and with each passing second, Marin's resolve crumbled a little more. "The wrong person," Princess Sigrid said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the baby's cries. "Or the person whose presence actually calms your son when nothing else does. Marin, I understand this hurts. I understand it violates every tradition we hold sacred. But look at him. Really look at him. He's in distress. Real genuine distress. And we have someone standing right here who can end that distress instantly. Are we really going to choose tradition over his well-being?" "A slave," Marin said, and the word dripped with venom and heartbreak. "A woman whose great-grandmother tried to assassinate my husband's grandfather during the Blood Moon Rebellion. A carrier of bloodline magic that nearly destroyed this kingdom and cost hundreds of innocent lives. That is who my son has chosen to trust, and you ask me to accept this as anything other than disaster. You ask me to watch her hold my child while he screams in my arms. I ask you to consider," Sigrid said carefully, crossing to where her sister-in-law stood trembling with grief and fury, "that sometimes the bonds we don't choose are the ones that save us. That sometimes prophecy fulfills itself not as punishment but as providence. That sometimes the very thing we fear most is exactly what we need most. Your son is different, Marin. He's gonna need different kinds of support, different kinds of bonds. Fighting that reality won't change it. It will only make his life harder. My bloodline tried to change this kingdom," Lisbeth said quietly from where she still knelt before the Alpha King, and she knew she was likely signing her own death warrant but unable to stop the words. "There's a difference between destruction and transformation, Your Majesty. The Blood Moon Rebellion wasn't about chaos for its own sake. It was about wolves who couldn't properly connect to traditional pack bonds, wolves born deaf or blind or damaged, wolves whose magic worked differently than the established norms, wolves who existed in the spaces between proper pack hierarchy. The Eastern Ridge clan wanted to create space in pack law for different kinds of bonds, different kinds of strength. And yes, some of my ancestors used violence to push that change. Yes, they made terrible choices that cost innocent lives and nearly shattered the kingdom. But their core desire wasn't evil. It was just ahead of its time." "Ahead of its time," Marin repeated bitterly, her voice breaking on the words. "And now here we are 60 years later, with a deaf heir who proves they might have been right all along. Is that what you're saying? That my son is validation for your treasonous ancestors? That his disability is somehow proof that pack law needs to change?" "I'm saying," Lisbeth replied carefully, her heart hammering but her voice steady, "that maybe the reason your son bonded with me isn't about bloodline magic or manipulation. Maybe it's because, on some instinctive level that has nothing to do with conscious thought or political scheming, he recognizes that I understand what it means to need different kinds of bonds than the ones pack law provides. And maybe that recognition is exactly what the prophecy was always about. Not a curse or a disaster, but an opportunity to finally finish what my ancestors started. To create a pack law that has room for wolves who are different. To transform tradition into something that includes rather than excludes. To prove that strength comes in forms we haven't learned to recognize yet." The silence that followed was profound. Then Theodoric stirred in his mother's arms, his cries taking on a note of genuine desperation that made even the hardest warriors in the room flinch. And Marin, exhausted, heartbroken, and completely out of options, did something that shocked everyone in the throne room. She crossed the distance to where Lisbeth knelt and held out her son. "Take him," Marin whispered. "Just for a moment. Let me see if it's real. Let me see if you can truly calm him, or if this is all some elaborate manipulation." Lisbeth rose slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the tiny bundle. The moment her fingers touched Theodoric's blanket, his crying began to quiet. When she lifted him against her chest, feeling his small heartbeat against her own, the screaming stopped entirely. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his tiny hands fisting in her rough servant's dress, and let out a sigh that sounded far too world-weary for an infant only hours old. The throne room was silent enough to hear a pin drop. "It's real," Marin breathed, and the devastation in her voice was absolute. "He really does prefer her. My son really does want a forbidden bloodline slave more than his own mother." "Not more than," Oracle Ursula said gently. "Different from. Your Majesty, the child doesn't understand preference or tradition or bloodline politics. He only knows that this woman communicates with him in ways that work for his different sensory experience. She's not replacing you. She's supplementing what you cannot yet provide because you haven't learned how to adapt to his unique needs." "Then I'll learn," Marin said fiercely, but tears were streaming down her face. "I'll study, adapt, find new ways to reach him. I'll become what he needs. But I will not keep forbidden blood in proximity to my son based on an infant's attachment that could disappear in days." "Enough debate," High Counselor Walther said, his voice cutting through the emotion like a blade. "The law is clear. Any person of forbidden bloodline cannot remain in proximity to the royal family without explicit alpha decree and full council approval. The Queen has ordered banishment. Unless the Alpha King countermands his Queen's direct order, an action that would itself violate Pack law regarding Luna Queen authority over household matters, the slave must be removed from the palace grounds by dawn. These are the laws that keep our kingdom stable, that prevent chaos and maintain proper hierarchy. We cannot abandon them because a deaf infant showed preference for the wrong person." Adelrich closed his eyes, and Lisbeth watched centuries of tradition and desperate innovation war across his face. When he opened them again, his decision was written in the hard set of his jaw. "Lisbeth of the Eastern Ridge bloodline," he said formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the throne room. "I cannot countermand my Queen's direct order without fracturing the very foundations of Pack law and undermining her authority in ways that would damage the kingdom's stability for generations. You will be banished from palace grounds at dawn, as ordered. However," he paused and something flickered in his eyes, "I invoke the right of royal witness. For the next 8 hours, until you pass through the palace gate at dawn, you will serve as appointed caregiver to my son under direct royal supervision. If the prophecy speaks true about a choice at the gate, then we will face it with full knowledge and preparation rather than blind ignorance. And if, in those 8 hours, you prove yourself a danger or a manipulator using forbidden magic to exploit my son's vulnerability, the banishment will proceed with additional punishment for treason against the heir. Execution by sunrise." "Your Majesty, this is madness," Walther protested. "You're giving her 8 hours to strengthen the bond, to make the separation at dawn even more catastrophic. You're playing directly into the prophecy's hands instead of preventing it." "This is kingship," Adelrich said coldly, his alpha command making several wolves step back. "I take a calculated risk rather than blindly following tradition into potential disaster." "Oracle Ursula, do the prophecies say anything about what happens if we try to prevent the third sign? If we send her away now, before the bond grows stronger?" "Only this," Ursula said, her blind eyes turning toward where baby Theodoric lay peaceful in Lisbeth's arms for the first time since his birth. "That attempts to thwart prophecy often fulfill it in twisted ways. That running from fate is the surest way to meet it unprepared. And that the silent alpha's choice at the gate will happen whether we arrange it or not. The only question is whether we face it with knowledge and preparation or with chaos and surprise. Delay does not prevent destiny, Your Majesty. It only ensures we meet it blind. Then we face it with eyes open," Adelrich declared. "Guards, escort Lisbeth to the royal nursery. She is under watch at all times, no less than 4 guards present, and she is forbidden from leaving the nursery chambers until dawn. No one enters or exits without my explicit permission. Marin, I know this is painful beyond measure, but if our son truly cannot bond with you in traditional ways, We need to understand why and how before we send away the one person who seems able to reach him. 8 hours. Give me 8 hours to understand this impossible situation before we lose the chance forever. Marin's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Fury, grief, wounded pride, maternal instinct, political calculation, and finally reluctant acceptance. She nodded once, sharp and bitter. 8 hours, she agreed, her voice hollow. And then she walks through that gate and never returns. And if, in those 8 hours, I discover any evidence that she's using forbidden bloodline magic to manipulate my son, she doesn't wait for banishment. She faces immediate execution for treason against the heir. Are we absolutely clear on these terms? Perfectly clear, Adelrich said. The guards surrounded Lisbeth then. 4 massive wolves in human form with hands on their weapons and expressions that made clear she would be dead before she took 3 steps toward an unauthorized exit. Captain Hrothgar, the largest with a scar running down his left cheek, positioned himself directly behind her. Henrik, a younger wolf with auburn hair and troubled eyes, took her left flank. 2 others whose names she didn't know completed the formation. They escorted her from the throne room, through corridors she'd only ever seen while scrubbing floors before dawn, up staircases meant for nobility rather than slaves. Other servants pressed themselves against walls to let the strange procession pass, their eyes wide with confusion and gossip that Lisbeth knew would spread through the palace like wildfire within the hour. The forbidden blood slave was carrying the heir to the throne. The queen's son had rejected his mother. The prophecy of the silent Alpha had begun to unfold exactly as the ancient texts predicted. And everyone wondered what would happen when dawn came and the 3rd sign arrived at the palace gate. The royal nursery occupied the top floor of the eastern tower, a circular room with windows facing in all directions and walls painted with murals of pack history. Ancient wolves ran across painted forests, their forms blending from human to wolf and back again in beautiful illustrations of the old magic that lived in every shifter's blood. Moon phases decorated the ceiling in silver paint. The cradle in the center was carved from ancient oak and inlaid with protective runes that glowed faintly in the lamplight. Except, Lisbeth thought as she looked down at the tiny face in her arms, this particular shifter couldn't hear the call that triggered transformation. This heir would face his wolf form differently than any alpha before him. He would need new rituals, new ways of connecting to the magic in his blood. Put the child in the cradle, Captain Hrothgar commanded. You're here to soothe him, not to bond with him further. He'll cry the moment I put him down, Lisbeth warned. Then he cries, Hrothgar said flatly. The Queen's orders were explicit. You're under watch, which means we need to be able to see both you and the heir at all times. Holding him close to your chest prevents proper visual monitoring. Put him in the cradle now. Lisbeth looked down at Theodoric. His eyes were closed now, his breathing soft and even in sleep. She could feel his small heartbeat against her palm, steady and strong despite his inability to hear the pack song that should have been thrumming through his blood like a second pulse. Slowly, careful not to wake him, she lowered him into the ornate cradle that had held 3 generations of Waldhart heirs. The moment his body left her arms, his eyes snapped open and he screamed. It wasn't the normal cry of an infant wanting food or comfort. It was a sound of pure betrayal and existential terror, as though being separated from Lisbeth represented a fundamental threat to his survival rather than simple discomfort. His small body went rigid, his face turning purple with the force of his cries, his hands clawing at empty air as though trying to grab onto something that was no longer there. The sound echoed off the nursery walls, magnified by the circular architecture until it felt like the room itself was screaming. Pick him up, Captain Hrothgar ordered after exactly 10 seconds of ear-splitting noise. Now! Lisbeth lifted Theodoric from the cradle, and the screaming stopped as though someone had flipped a switch. He buried his face against her shoulder, his tiny hands gripping her rough servant's dress with desperate strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone so small and new. His breathing gradually slowed as he calmed against her chest, his small body melting into her hold as though he'd finally found safety after hours of terror. This is unnatural, Henrik muttered, his hand tightening on his weapon. No infant bonds this strongly this quickly. Has to be forbidden magic. Eastern Ridge bloodline manipulation of emotional bonds. Or, Lisbeth said tiredly, settling into the rocking chair positioned beside the cradle. He's a deaf child who spent his first hours in absolute chaos he cannot process, surrounded by pack bonds he cannot feel, held by people whose wolf song he cannot hear. Maybe I'm not using forbidden magic. Maybe I'm just the first person he's met who isn't trying to communicate through channels that simply don't exist for him. Explain, Hrothgar demanded. His hand still on his weapon but his expression shifting to something like reluctant curiosity. Lisbeth adjusted Theodoric against her shoulder, feeling his small heartbeat begin to slow as he relaxed into her hold. Think about it from his perspective. He was born into a throne room full of hundreds of wolves, all of them connected by pack bonds that sing through shared magic. Bonds that create an invisible web of belonging and hierarchy and family connection that every other wolf can feel as naturally as breathing. He can't feel any of it. To him, it must be like being surrounded by people who are all participating in a conversation he's completely excluded from. They're all communicating on a level he can't access, sharing emotions and loyalties and connections through channels that simply don't exist in his sensory world. It must be terrifying beyond anything we can imagine, to be surrounded by family and still be utterly, completely alone in your experience of reality. She paused, gently rocking, letting the rhythm soothe both herself and the baby in her arms. Outside the windows, the night was at its darkest point. Dawn would come in approximately 7 hours, and with it, the moment that would determine not just her fate but possibly the fate of the entire kingdom. But I'm Eastern Ridge bloodline, she continued quietly. My family's affinity has always been for sensing broken bonds and weak connections in pack structure. Not to exploit them, whatever the history books say, but to feel them, to understand them, to exist in the spaces between normal pack magic where traditional bonds don't quite reach. When your people executed my great-grandmother and shattered our clan connections during the purge that followed the Blood Moon Rebellion, my family lost the ability to properly connect to the traditional pack song. We exist in the silence between bonds, in the gaps where magic doesn't flow the way it should, in the empty spaces that most wolves never even know exist because they've never experienced life outside the constant hum of pack connection. And maybe, her voice caught slightly, maybe that's exactly what this baby needs right now. Someone who understands what it means to exist outside the normal channels. Someone who isn't trying to force a connection through pack magic that doesn't work for him. Someone who just sees him as he is, not as what pack law says he should be. Someone who lives in the same silence he does. The guards exchanged glances. Hrothgar's hand remained on his weapon, but his expression had shifted from hostile certainty to troubled consideration. Henrik looked downright conflicted, his previous suspicion warring with something that might have been sympathy or even understanding. That's a compelling argument, Hrothgar said finally. But it doesn't change the fact that you're forbidden blood in proximity to the heir. Doesn't change the prophecy. And it doesn't change what happens at dawn when you walk through that palace gate, and we discover whether an hours-old infant can somehow make choices that determine the fate of entire kingdoms. I know, Lisbeth said softly, looking down at Theodoric's peaceful sleeping face. His features were perfect. Tiny nose, delicate eyelashes, mouth slightly open in the complete relaxation of infant sleep. He looked so innocent, so unaware of the political maelstrom his birth had created. Believe me, I know exactly what's at stake. And I know that no matter what happens in the next 7 hours, my life is probably over. Either I walk through that gate at dawn and get banished to the outer territories where I'll likely die within a month, or I stay and the council finds evidence of manipulation and I face execution for treason. There's no version of this story where I survive. Then why help him? Henrik asked suddenly. If you're going to die anyway, why spend your last hours caring for the heir of the family that destroyed your clan? Why not just let him scream? Why not make them suffer the way your family suffered? The question hung in the air, and Lisbeth realized that this was the real test. Not whether she could soothe Theodoric, but whether her motivations were revenge or genuine care. Whether she was using this baby as a tool for delayed vengeance or actually trying to help an infant who needed someone to understand his unique way of experiencing the world. Because he's innocent, Lisbeth said simply. Because he didn't choose to be born deaf or to be heir to a throne that will demand things from him that he's not equipped to provide in traditional ways. Because he's scared and alone and surrounded by people who love him but don't understand him. And because... She paused, surprised by the tears that suddenly stung her eyes. Because I remember what it felt like to be different in a world that had no room for difference. My mother was born with weak pack bonds, barely able to feel the connections that other wolves took for granted. The other servants mocked her, called her broken and useless. She died when I was 8, and I've spent the last 15 years learning to be invisible, learning to exist in the spaces where no one would notice or care that I was different too. And if I can prevent this baby from growing up feeling that same isolation, that same sense of being fundamentally wrong for existing the way he exists, then maybe my life meant something after all. The silence that followed was profound. Even Hrothgar looked affected, his hard expression softening slightly. Then the nursery door opened and Queen Maren entered, followed by Princess Sigrid, Oracle Ursula, and surprisingly, a wet nurse named Gretchen carrying supplies. Maren's eyes went immediately to her son, and Lisbeth saw the flash of pain when Theodoric didn't react to his mother's presence at all, not because he was rejecting her, but because he simply couldn't hear or sense her approach the way a normal wolf pup would through pack bonds. "Report," Sigrid said to Captain Hrothgar. "Has there been any evidence of forbidden magic or manipulation?" "No, Your Highness," Hrothgar admitted reluctantly. "Just attachment. Unnaturally strong attachment, perhaps, but no overt evidence of magical interference. The heir won't tolerate separation from the slave for more than seconds before becoming severely distressed." "Not unnatural," Oracle Ursula said, her blind eyes somehow finding Lisbeth unerringly across the room. "Prophesied. The silent alpha bonds with forbidden blood, not through pack magic or forced connection, but through recognition of shared isolation. This child knows, somehow, on an instinctive level that has nothing to do with conscious thought, that this woman understands what he cannot hear. And in that understanding, he's found the first real security of his short life." "This doesn't mean we keep her," Maren said, but her voice lacked conviction and her eyes were red from recent tears. "This doesn't mean we abandon every law and tradition because an infant formed an attachment to the wrong person during a moment of vulnerability." "Doesn't it?" Sigrid asked gently, crossing to where Lisbeth sat with Theodoric. "Maren, I've watched you for the past 4 hours. I've seen you trying to hold him, trying to soothe him, trying to be the mother you've dreamed of being since you first learned you were carrying the heir. And I've seen the absolute devastation on your face every time he screams in your arms like you're causing him pain just by touching him. This isn't about right or wrong anymore. This isn't about tradition or law or political stability. This is about what's best for your son. What's best for my son is growing up surrounded by proper pack bonds and traditional pack law," Maren said, but her voice broke on the words. "What's best for my son is learning to be an alpha from his father and learning to be a wolf from his mother and his pack. Not from a slave whose bloodline tried to destroy this kingdom. Not from someone who exists outside every bond that makes us who we are." "Then teach me," Lisbeth said suddenly, and everyone turned to stare at her. "Your Majesty, if you truly believe that traditional knowledge is what he needs, then teach me those traditions so I can help bridge the gap. I'm not trying to replace you. I could never replace you. You're his mother, you carried him. You'll always be the Luna Queen he answers to. But maybe I can be a translator of sorts. Someone who learns from you and then adapts those lessons in ways that work for his different sensory experience. Someone who helps him feel connected to pack traditions, even though he experiences them differently than other wolves." Maren stared at her for a long moment, emotions warring across her face. "You would learn from me. The woman whose family killed your great-grandmother and destroyed your clan would teach you, and you would accept that teaching." "Yes," Lisbeth said simply. "Because this isn't about our family's history. This is about an infant who needs both of us, your wisdom and my adaptation. Your tradition and my understanding of what it means to exist outside traditional bonds. He needs both, Your Majesty. Not one or the other. The council will never allow this arrangement, High Counselor Walther said from the doorway, where he'd apparently been listening. Even if we accept that the child has formed an unusual attachment, we cannot set a precedent of keeping forbidden bloodlines in the royal household. It violates too many laws, creates too many dangerous possibilities for future manipulation. Then change the laws, Princess Sigrid said sharply. Walther, you've served this kingdom for 30 years. You've seen laws change and adapt as circumstances demand. This is one of those moments. We have a deaf heir, something that's never happened before in recorded Waldhart history. The old laws don't account for this situation because they were written when everyone assumed all heirs would be able to hear the pack song. We need new laws for a new reality. New laws take months to draft and approve through proper council channels, Walther countered. We have 7 hours until dawn. And even if we could draft new laws that quickly, implementing them without proper debate and consideration sets a dangerous precedent of the Crown acting unilaterally to circumvent established legal processes. Then we use those 7 hours to gather information, Adelrich said, entering the nursery with a thick tome under his arm. Oracle Ursula, you said the prophecy of the silent alpha speaks of a choice at the gate. Read me the exact wording. Every word matters if we're going to understand what we're actually facing at dawn. Ursula stepped forward, her blind eyes closing as she recited from memory. When the silent alpha takes his first breath, 3 signs shall mark his path. First, he shall reject the mother's blessing, turning from sacred bonds that have held since the first age. Second, he shall bond with forbidden blood, finding comfort in the very darkness that tradition fears. Third, at the palace gate, he shall face a choice between the love that calls him and the law that binds him. If he chooses love, the old bonds shall shatter and new bonds shall form, and the wolf kingdom shall transform or fall as one. If he chooses law, the bonds shall hold but the kingdom shall fracture from within, pack turning against pack until the blood moon rises again and the cycle repeats. The choice cannot be unmade. The moment cannot be undone. What happens at the gate shall echo through generations. The nursery fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of those words. So the prophecy doesn't actually say which choice is correct, Sigrid said slowly. It just says that either choice has massive consequences. Choose love and the old bonds shatter but new ones form. Choose law and the bonds hold but everything fractures from within. It's a paradox, Marin whispered. Either way something breaks. Either way, the kingdom faces catastrophe. Or transformation, Lisbeth said quietly. The prophecy says, transform or fall as one, if he chooses love. That means there's a possibility of transformation rather than destruction. A possibility of the kingdoms changing together rather than fracturing apart. But that requires trusting in new kinds of bonds rather than clinging to old ones that don't work for him. And if we choose wrong? Marin demanded. If we trust in this transformation and it turns out to be destruction, if we abandon the laws that have kept this kingdom stable for 3 centuries and discover too late that those laws were the only thing holding us together, then we fall, Adelrich said grimly. But if we cling to those laws and force my son to choose tradition over the bond that actually works for him, the prophecy says the kingdom fractures from within. Pack against pack. The blood moon rising again. That sounds like civil war to me. Another rebellion, possibly worse than the one 60 years ago. So our choices are immediate transformation with unknown consequences, or delayed civil war with predictable devastation, Walther summarized. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but those are both terrible options. They're the only options we have, Ursula said. The prophecy has been spoken. The signs are manifesting. We can try to control how we face the choice at the gate, but we cannot prevent the choice itself from occurring. The question is whether we face it united and prepared, or divided and surprised. Then we prepare, Adelrich decided. Marin, I know this goes against everything you believe about proper royal protocol and bloodline purity. But I'm asking you, not as your Alpha King, but as your husband and the father of your child, to trust me for the next 7 hours. Let Lisbeth care for Theodoric under supervision. Let's observe how she interacts with him, what techniques she uses to soothe him, whether there's any evidence of forbidden magic or manipulation. And if, at the end of those 7 hours, we find no evidence of wrongdoing, then we make a decision together about what happens at dawn. Maren looked at her husband for a long moment, and Lisbeth could see the battle raging behind her eyes. Pride and pain. Love and law. The mother who wanted to be enough for her son warring with the queen who had to consider the kingdom's stability. 7 hours, Maren said finally. But I stay here. I watch every moment. And if I see anything that suggests manipulation or forbidden magic, she dies immediately. No trial, no debate, no mercy. Are we clear? Perfectly clear, Adelrich said. And so began the strangest 7 hours of Lisbeth's life. Maren took up position in a chair directly across from where Lisbeth sat with Theodoric, her pale blue eyes never leaving her son's face. Sigrid settled nearby with parchment and ink, apparently intending to document everything that happened. Ursula positioned herself by the window, her blind eyes turned toward something only she could see. The 4 guards maintained their posts at the corners of the room, hands on weapons, ready to kill Lisbeth at the first sign of treachery. Talk to him, Maren commanded after several minutes of silence. Tell me what you're doing. Every gesture, every technique, every reason behind your actions. I want to understand what makes you different from every other caregiver who's tried to soothe him. Lisbeth looked down at Theodoric, who had fallen into a light doze against her chest. Right now, I'm just letting him feel my heartbeat and my breathing. The rhythm is soothing to all infants, but especially to him because he can't hear the pack song that normally provides that constant rhythmic connection for wolf pups. My heartbeat becomes his anchor. Steady, reliable, always there. I have a heartbeat, Maren said, her voice tight. Why doesn't mine work? It probably would given time and patience, Lisbeth said carefully. But when he was first born, you were exhausted from the birth. Your heartbeat was racing from stress and exertion, and you were trying to use pack bonds to soothe him at the same time. For a deaf child, that must have been overwhelming. Feeling your elevated heart rate while everyone around him was using magic he couldn't access. It probably felt chaotic and frightening rather than soothing. So I was too stressed to comfort my own son, Maren said bitterly. You'd just given birth to the heir to the throne in front of 300 witnesses, Sigrid interjected gently. Anyone would have been stressed. Lisbeth had the advantage of approaching him when she was calm and he was already in distress, creating a clear contrast. It's not a failing on your part, Maren. It's just unfortunate timing. Theodoric stirred then, his face scrunching up in a way that suggested he was about to cry. Without thinking, Lisbeth began to hum, the same wordless lullaby she'd hummed before, old and simple and rhythmic. He can't hear that, Walther said from the doorway. No, but he can feel the vibration through my chest, Lisbeth explained, continuing to hum. It's similar to the heartbeat anchor but with more variation, more pattern. It gives him something to focus on, something that's both constant and changing. Most importantly, it's something I can control and adapt. If he gets more agitated, I can hum faster to match his energy and then gradually slow down, bringing his energy down with me. It's a technique my mother used with me when I was small and couldn't sleep. Your mother who had weak pack bonds, Ursula said thoughtfully. She couldn't soothe you through traditional pack magic, so she learned alternative methods. Methods you're now using with this child. Yes, Lisbeth admitted. Teach me, Maren said suddenly. Show me how to do that. The humming, the rhythm, all of it. If these are techniques that work for children who can't access pack bonds, then I need to learn them. I need to be able to comfort my own son. Lisbeth looked up in surprise. Your Majesty, I. Don't argue with me, Maren said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. You said you weren't trying to replace me. Prove it. Teach me how to reach my son the way you can reach him. Help me become the mother he needs rather than the mother I planned to be. And so, over the next several hours, something unexpected happened. Lisbeth taught the Luna Queen how to soothe a deaf infant. She showed Marin how to position Theodoric so he could feel her heartbeat clearly, demonstrated the humming technique, and helped Marin find a rhythm that worked. Explained how to use gentle vibrations and touch to communicate rather than relying on voice or pack bonds. At first, Theodoric still screamed when Marin tried to hold him. The transition from Lisbeth's arms to his mother's arms triggered his panic response, and his cries echoed off the nursery walls with heartbreaking intensity. But Marin persisted. She hummed the way Lisbeth had shown her, adjusted her grip to maximize the heartbeat connection, and gradually, so gradually that Lisbeth wasn't sure anyone else noticed, Theodoric's cries began to quiet. Took 45 minutes. 45 minutes of patient, determined effort while tears streamed down Marin's face and her arms trembled with exhaustion. But finally, Theodoric calmed in his mother's arms. He didn't fall asleep the way he did with Lisbeth, but he stopped screaming. His small body relaxed slightly. His breathing evened out. And Marin looked at Lisbeth with an expression that combined gratitude and devastation in equal measure. "He still prefers you," Marin said quietly. "Even now, I can feel that he's tolerating this rather than truly comfortable. But it's progress. More progress than I've made in all the hours since his birth." "It takes time," Lisbeth said gently. "You're learning a completely new way of communicating with him. Of course he's more comfortable with me right now. I've been using these techniques instinctively because they're what I grew up with. But you're adapting faster than anyone could reasonably expect. In a few days, a few weeks, you'll be as natural at this as breathing. And then he'll bond with you the way a proper heir should bond with his mother." "In a few weeks," Marin repeated. "But the prophecy says the choice happens at dawn." She glanced at the window, where the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep blue. "In approximately 3 hours. What happens then? What choice does an infant make at the palace gate?" "I don't know," Lisbeth admitted. "But whatever happens, you'll be better prepared to handle it than you were 8 hours ago. You've learned new ways to reach him. You've proven that the bond between mother and son can exist even without traditional pack magic. That's not nothing, Your Majesty." "But it's not enough," Marin said. "Is it? Because the prophecy speaks of him choosing between love and law. And right now, the love that calls him is you, not me. When you walk through that gate at dawn, he's going to react. And that reaction will determine the fate of kingdoms." The weight of that reality settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. "Perhaps," Oracle Ursula said from her position by the window, "we're thinking about this wrong. The prophecy says he faces a choice between the love that calls him and the law that binds him. We've been assuming the love is Lisbeth and the law is tradition. But what if the choice is more nuanced than that?" "Explain," Adele Rich commanded. "The love that calls him could be the love of a mother who's learning to adapt, the love of a father who's willing to change laws to protect his son's well-being, the love of a kingdom that chooses transformation over stagnation. And the law that binds him could be the rigid tradition that says disabled heirs are vulnerable, that forbidden bloodlines must be excluded, that different equals dangerous. The choice might not be between Lisbeth and tradition. It might be between a kingdom that evolves to include him and a kingdom that forces him to conform or be cast out." "That's a generous interpretation," Walther said skeptically. "But it doesn't change the practical reality. At dawn, Lisbeth walks through the palace gate because the queen ordered her banishment, and we cannot violate pack law by countermanding that order without council approval. The infant will react to her departure. And whatever that reaction is will either validate the prophecy's warning or prove it was just superstitious nonsense that we gave too much weight." "It's not superstitious nonsense," Ursula said sharply. "I've studied the prophecies for 6 decades. The prophecy of the Silent Alpha has been verified by 7 independent oracles across 3 generations. It's as real as the ground beneath our feet and as inevitable as sunrise." "Then we're trapped," Marin said, her voice hollow. "Either we keep forbidden blood in the royal household and violate every law that keeps our kingdom stable, or we send her away and face whatever catastrophe the prophecy promises. Those are our only options." "No," Sigrid said suddenly, looking up from her parchment where she'd been frantically scribbling notes. There's a third option. We change the law. Not circumvent it, not ignore it, but actually change it through proper legal channels. The Alpha King has the authority to call an emergency council session. If we can get majority approval from the council before dawn, we can create a new legal category, something like special caregiver to a disabled heir, that allows for exceptions to the forbidden bloodline laws under specific, tightly controlled circumstances. An emergency council session requires at least 8 council members present, Walther said. At this hour, most of them are asleep in their estates outside the palace. We'd need to send riders, wake them, convince them to ride to the palace in darkness, and then hold a formal session with proper debate and voting. All in less than 3 hours. It's impossible. So we make it possible, Adelrich said, his alpha command filling the room. Walther, send riders to every council member within a 2-hour radius. Tell them I'm invoking emergency council authority under threat of prophetic fulfillment. Tell them that if they don't attend, they're abandoning their oaths to protect the kingdom in its hour of greatest need. And tell them that history will remember who showed up when the silent Alpha needed them. Your Majesty. Now, Walther. The High Counselor bowed and left, his footsteps echoing down the tower stairs. For the next 2 hours, the nursery became the center of frantic activity. Riders galloped out in all directions. Council members began arriving in various states of dress and confusion. Sigrid drafted and redrafted the proposed law, arguing with Ursula over exact wording while Adelrich paced and Marin continued practicing her new techniques with Theodoric. And through it all, Lisbeth sat in the rocking chair with the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest, wondering if she was about to witness the transformation of a kingdom or its destruction. As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the eastern sky, a messenger burst into the nursery. Your Majesty, the council has assembled. 14 members present. More than enough for quorum. They're waiting in the throne room. Then we go now, Adelrich said. He turned to Lisbeth. Bring my son. Let the council see what we're actually debating. Let them see an infant who needs different kinds of care rather than arguing about abstract legal principles. The procession down to the throne room felt like a death march. Guards surrounded Lisbeth on all sides. Marin walked beside her, close enough to take Theodoric if he became distressed. Adelrich led the way with Sigrid and Ursula flanking him. And behind them came a growing crowd of nobles and servants who'd heard that something momentous was happening. The throne room had been hastily prepared for an emergency session. 14 council members sat in a semicircle facing the throne, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile to deeply troubled. Lord Werner of the Northern Reaches looked actively angry. Lady Beatrix of the Eastern Territories seemed fascinated. Councillor Jacob, the youngest at barely 30, appeared terrified. Explain, Lord Werner said without preamble the moment Adelrich took his throne. Your emergency summons claimed prophetic crisis. What prophecy are we supposedly facing? And why does it require violating pack law by keeping forbidden blood in the royal household? And so Adelrich explained. The deaf heir. The rejected mother's blessing. The bond with forbidden blood. The prophecy of the silent Alpha. The choice at the palace gate that would happen at sunrise, which was now approximately 30 minutes away. This is nonsense, Lord Werner said when Adelrich finished. Prophecies are metaphorical guidance, not literal instructions for lawmaking. You're asking us to overturn centuries of legal precedent because your son cried less with a slave than with his mother. That's not prophecy. That's just an infant being fussy during a stressful birth. Then explain this, Adelrich said, gesturing to Lisbeth. Approach the throne. Lisbeth walked forward slowly, Theodoric still sleeping peacefully in her arms. When she reached the base of the throne, Adelrich spoke clearly enough for every council member to hear. This child has not slept for more than 5 consecutive minutes in anyone's arms except Lisbeth's since his birth 8 hours ago. He screams when separated from her. He only calms when he can feel her heartbeat. Every caregiver we've attempted to introduce has failed. Watch what happens when I take him from her now." Before Lisbeth could protest, Adelrich lifted Theodoric from her arms. The baby's eyes snapped open and he screamed, that same sound of pure terror that had echoed through the throne room at his birth. His small body went rigid in his father's arms, his hands reaching desperately back toward Lisbeth. "Now watch this," Adelrich said, and handed Theodoric back to Lisbeth. The screaming stopped instantly. Theodoric buried his face in her neck, his tiny hands fisting in her dress, his breathing gradually slowing as he calmed. The throne room was absolutely silent. "That is not normal infant behavior," Adelrich said quietly. "That is a prophesied bond forming exactly as the ancient texts predicted. And in approximately 25 minutes, that woman will walk through the palace gate unless this council gives me legal authority to keep her here. So I'm asking, are you willing to risk the prophecy's warning about kingdoms fracturing from within? Are you willing to gamble that the oracles who verified this prophecy for 3 generations were all wrong? Or are you willing to adapt our laws to account for circumstances we've never faced before?" The council erupted into argument. Voices shouted over each other, debating prophecy interpretation, legal precedent, political ramifications, bloodline purity, and a dozen other concerns. Lady Beatrix argued passionately for creating legal exceptions. Lord Werner insisted that accommodating this situation would set dangerous precedents. Councillor Jacob worried about the heir's legitimacy if raised by forbidden blood. And through it all, the sun continued to rise. "Vote," Marin said suddenly, her voice cutting through the chaos with Luna Queen authority. "Stop debating and vote. We have 20 minutes until the prophecy's timeline completes itself. Vote on whether to create the legal category that allows this woman to stay as special caregiver to our son. Vote on whether transformation is worth the risk. Vote now." The council fell silent. Adelrich gestured to Sigrid, who read the proposed law in a clear, strong voice. "Be it enacted that in cases of royal heirs born with disabilities that prevent traditional pack bond formation, the Alpha King may appoint a special caregiver of any bloodline to serve under direct royal supervision for the purpose of providing adapted care that traditional caregivers cannot provide. Said special caregiver will have no authority, no freedom of movement, no access to political decisions, and will serve solely at the pleasure of the Alpha King and Luna Queen. Any evidence of manipulation or forbidden magic will result in immediate execution. This law applies only to documented cases of disabled heirs and cannot be used to circumvent general restrictions on forbidden bloodlines in the royal household." "All in favor," Adelrich commanded. 8 hands went up. 8 council members willing to risk transformation. "All opposed." 6 hands. 6 council members clinging to tradition. "The measure passes," Adelrich declared. "As of this moment, Lisbeth of the Eastern Ridge bloodline is appointed special caregiver to heir Theodoric under the terms just specified. The banishment order is revoked. The prophecy's 3rd sign will not occur. We have chosen transformation over fracture. The prophecy's 3rd sign will absolutely occur," Oracle Ursula said, her voice cutting through the celebration. "Because in 6 minutes, the sun will fully rise. And the moment it does, according to the prophecy's exact wording, the silent Alpha must face his choice at the palace gate. The choice happens at sunrise, not before. We haven't prevented it. We've only changed the circumstances under which it occurs." "What are you saying?" Marin demanded. "I'm saying," Ursula replied, "that we need to go to the palace gate right now. All of us. Because when the sun rises, Theodoric will make his choice. And we need to be there to witness it and respond accordingly." The procession to the palace gate was the strangest Lisbeth had ever seen. The Alpha King and Luna Queen leading the way. 14 council members following. Princess Sigrid with her parchment still clutched in one hand. Oracle Ursula with her staff clicking against the marble floors. Guards surrounding everyone. And Lisbeth in the center, carrying the infant heir who was about to make a choice that would determine the fate of kingdoms. They reached the massive iron gate just as the sun's first rays touched the eastern horizon. The gate stood open, as it always did at sunrise, ready to welcome traders and petitioners and anyone with legitimate business in the palace. "What now?" Delrich asked. "The sun is rising. Where is the choice? What are we supposed to be witnessing?" "The choice," Ursula said slowly, "between the love that calls him and the law that binds him. I think," she turned her blind eyes toward Lisbeth, "I think you need to step through the gate. Fulfill the original banishment order symbolically. Walk through and see what happens." "You want me to walk away from him?" Lisbeth asked, looking down at Theodoric's sleeping face. "The prophecy says he faces a choice when someone he's bonded with leaves through the palace gate," Ursula explained. "We changed the law, but the moment must still occur. Walk through the gate. Give him the choice. Let's see if transformation truly chose us, or if we're still heading toward catastrophe." Lisbeth looked at Marin, who nodded slowly. Then at Delrich, who gestured toward the gate. Then down at Theodoric, still sleeping peacefully in her arms. She walked toward the gate. With each step, her heart hammered harder. This was it, the moment the prophecy had warned about. The choice that would determine everything. She crossed the threshold of the gate, stepping from palace grounds onto the public road beyond. And Theodoric's eyes snapped open. He didn't scream this time. Instead, he looked directly at Lisbeth's face with an intensity that seemed impossible for an infant only 8 hours old. His silver eyes, so like his father's but somehow already carrying their own unique awareness, locked onto hers. And then he reached for her. Not with panic or fear, but with deliberate intent. His tiny hand stretched toward her face, and when she instinctively leaned closer, he touched her cheek with surprising gentleness. In that moment, Lisbeth felt something shift in the world. Not pack bonds or forbidden magic or anything she could name. Just a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place, of a choice being made that transcended law and tradition and everything else they'd been arguing about. "The choice has been made," Ursula breathed. "Love over law. Bond over tradition. Transformation over stagnation. The silent alpha has spoken." "But he didn't speak," Lord Werner protested. "He's an infant." He reached for his caregiver. "That's not a mystical choice. That's just what babies do." "Is it?" Ursula asked. "Then why did the very air change the moment he made that gesture? Why do the pack bonds throughout the palace feel different suddenly? Looser, more flexible, more willing to include variations? Why do I sense new possibilities opening where only rigid tradition existed before? The choice has been made, Lord Werner. Whether you acknowledge it or not." Lisbeth walked back through the gate, Theodoric still touching her face with one small hand. As she crossed back onto palace grounds, the baby smiled, the first smile of his young life, and then closed his eyes and fell back into peaceful sleep. "So," Delrich said quietly, "it's done. The prophecy has fulfilled itself. Now we live with the consequences and pray we chose correctly." "We chose correctly," Marin said, and her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Because my son is peaceful for the first time since his birth. Because we found a way to include rather than exclude. Because we chose to evolve rather than fracture. That's not catastrophe. That's hope." And as the sun fully rose over the walled heart palace, bathing everything in golden light, Lisbeth realized that maybe, just maybe, this was what transformation looked like. Not perfect, not easy, not without ongoing challenges and political complications and 1,000 details still to figure out. But possible. Finally beautifully possible. The deaf heir had made his choice. The forbidden blood would stay. And the kingdom would learn to sing new songs that even the silent could hear. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Now the real work of transformation could